Okay, over a couple of videos we're going to take a look at topics related to bond yields and the term structure of interest rates. So let's go ahead and get started here with the first video, and we'll take a look at various components of interest rates. What comprises the interest rate that we observe for a particular security? So first we're going to start with the base rate, also called the benchmark rate. And that's just going to be the yield to maturity of the most recently issued Treasury security for a particular maturity. And that most recently issued refers to this idea of on the run. So something that's been the most recently issued security is on the run. It's going to have the most liquidity. If it is not the most recently issued, it's going to be called off the run, and it's no longer part of our benchmark rate. The benchmark rate can be thought of as a real rate of return, along with an inflation premium and a maturity premium if that's applicable. So if we're talking about very short securities, the inflation premium will be negligible if existent at all. There won't be a maturity premium, and so the rate that we're going to get is going to be really close to a real rate of return. For the short-term rate, we're going to be looking at T-bills that have short durations. So again, there's little, if any, inflation premium and little, if any, maturity premium, and so we'll have what is in essence a risk-free rate of return. On top of that, so on top of the risk-free rate of return, we're going to tack in the inflation premium if it's applicable, a maturity premium, and any other risk premia that are applicable to the bond. So for corporate bonds and other bonds that have the possibility to default, we're going to have a credit premium or a default risk premium added to it. There's liquidity risk. We have reinvestment risk, the risk of call for callable bonds, etc. So all of these risks are going to be priced, and we're going to add a risk premium to the interest rate for a bond to come up with that final number, that final interest rate, or the final yield required for a particular security. All right, let's go ahead and move on to credit spreads. This is an important idea in the bond world, and anytime we're talking about a spread, we're talking about, actually it's more generalized than even this. It's a difference between what you're interested in and some baseline number. So it doesn't have to be the benchmark rate, but it's a benchmark rate. You're comparing two different numbers, two different interest rates. In this case, I am using the benchmark rate of the Treasury, the 2-year Treasury. That's going to be the benchmark at 2.09%. And I'm comparing it to a similar maturity for a corporate bond. The corporate has a 3.12% yield. If I look at the spread, in this case it's the benchmark spread, the spread between the comparable benchmark security, my spread is 1.03%. Now there's a few different ways to talk about spreads, to think about them. It's reporting kind of the same information just with a different lens. So if we look at this idea of the relative yield spread, we're going to take the spread and divide that by the benchmark rate. So in this case, we've got the spread that we just calculated as 1.03%. We divide that by the benchmark rate of 2.09%, and we come up with this number here, this result, 49.3. That's the relative yield spread, 49.3% bigger to have the corporate security compared to the Treasury. And a third way to look at the spreads is to look at a yield ratio, and that's simply going to be the yield on the security that you're interested in divided by the benchmark yield. So we're going to have this result here, 3.12% divided by 2.09, we get 1.493. Basically it's saying the same thing that we looked at before. It's 49.3% bigger to have the corporate security. The yield is 49.3% bigger for the corporate than the Treasury. All right, let's move on here and look at some credit spreads. So this is another spread that we can talk about, and again, a very important spread in the bond world. And a AAA spread, for instance, is just going to be the difference between a basket of highly rated, that is AAA rated, corporate bonds and the comparable Treasury. So if you look over here at the picture, the green plot is the Treasury yield curve over a variety of maturities, starting over at the extreme left with 30 days and then extending out to 30 years at the far right. So the green plot is the Treasuries. The blue one here in the middle is going to be the AAA yield curve. And the difference between those at any point in time, so if we look at the vertical axis and compare the difference between the 2 points, that difference is going to be the credit spread, the AAA spread. So it's the difference between the AAA bonds and the Treasuries for that same maturity. And the same thing for a triple B. That's going to be the difference between a basket of triple B bonds and the comparable treasury, that is the treasury with the same maturity. So the triple B spread will just be the spread between this red line up here, this red plot I should say, and the green plot. So that is the idea of credit spreads. You're getting paid more in essence for the default risk, the credit risk that you're taking on, and so the yield is going to be higher. So a couple more to look at. Maturity spread. This is going to be the difference between the two maturities for bonds that are otherwise the same. So if we have comparable bonds, the only thing different between them is when they mature. We can look at the yields for those two bonds, look at the difference in those yields, and that's going to be the maturity spread. So for example, a widely followed maturity spread is the difference between the 10-year treasury and the 2-year treasury. So for example, if the 10-year treasuries are yielding 3%, 3.00%, and the 2-year treasuries are yielding 2.67, that means there's a maturity spread, in this case the 2 to 10 year spread, of 33 basis points. And a yield curve is just going to be that picture of interest rates as they change across a variety of maturities. We've already looked at the yield curve in this picture over here. The green one is the yield curve for treasuries, the blue one is the yield curve for AAAs, and the red one is the yield curve for triple B bonds. Now these are treasuries over a variety of time periods. So for the past 4 years we've got different things going on. So in 2015, which is the light green yield curve here, we've got the steepest of the 4 yield curves. It starts at the lowest point and ends almost at the highest point, close to 3%. So that's the steepest one. It's steeper than any of the others in this particular picture. In 2016, you can see with this lighter yellow here that interest rates on the low end crept up a little bit. On the long end of the yield curve, however, they were lower than in 2015. So what happened is that yield curve flattened between 2015 and 2016. If you look at the 2017 yield curve, it's basically just phase shifted from the 2016 curve. All along the different maturities, it looks like the 2016 yield curve just moved up, and it moved up on the short end from about 0.2% to 1%, on the long end from 2.2% to about 2.8%, 2.9%. So almost a parallel shift all along the way. And then this last yield curve, the 2018 yield curve, are moving closer certainly to a flat yield curve. It's not quite flat, but it's much flatter than any of the others because the short end has gone up quite a bit. The long end hasn't moved up as much, especially over the past year. So by definition, we've been getting flatter. And so right now what we have is just about a 100 basis point difference between the extreme short end and the 30-year long end. One more spread to talk about, option adjusted spread. Anytime we have an embedded option in a bond, so that is, we might have a callable bond, we can have a convertible or a puttable bond. These options affect the spreads for a bond. So whenever we have a callable bond, it's going to widen the spread on the benchmark. If we have convertible or puttable bonds, it's going to narrow the spread on the benchmark. And that's going to be kind of an artificial or a misleading spread if we just look at the difference between the yield on a callable bond and the yield on a comparable treasury. What the option adjusted spread does is it removes the effect of the option, removes the effect on the yield by virtue of that option being in the bond. And so it allows us to have an apples to apples comparison with other bonds. So the option adjusted spread takes out the effect of the option and gets the spread where it's applicable to other bonds at the same maturity with that same benchmark. Alright, last topic for this video, we're going to look at the taxability of interest, and in particular think about municipal bonds and how after-tax yields and pre-tax yields are related. So because the interest on municipal bonds is typically exempt from federal, state, and local taxes, it's important to be able to compare the yields on municipal bonds, on these tax-free bonds, with other bonds. So for high tax rate individuals, for instance, especially in high tax locales, this is a very meaningful, a very important consideration in investing. So it wouldn't be as important for states without an income tax, or if you have bonds that are only going into tax advantaged accounts. We're not going to be really concerned with this after-tax yield, the pre-tax yield, the equivalent taxable yield, etc. But let's now consider that we do care let's look and see what the after-tax yield is. It's just going to be equal to the pre-tax yield on a bond multiplied by 1 minus the marginal tax rate. So for instance, if we earn 6.5% on a bond and we have a 45% combined marginal tax rate, so that's state, federal, and local. If our marginal tax rate is 45%, our after-tax yield is going to be 6.5% times 1 minus 45%. So we're going to multiply that times 0.55, and the result would be 3.575. That's our after-tax yield on the bonds. That's what we really get to spend. And so that's what we're going to really care about, is the 3.575. Now, an equivalent taxable yield is kind of reversing everything and looking at if we've got a yield on a bond that's not taxable, we can in essence gross that yield up to see how it would compare to fully taxable yields. So in this case, we're going to take the tax exempt yield and divide it by 1 minus the marginal tax rate. So if we use that same example we did before, if you earn 3.575% on a tax exempt bond, it's the same as earning a 6.5% return on a taxable bond. So those two things are functionally equivalent because of the marginal tax rate that a person faces. We're going to stop here and we'll pick up at this point in the next video.